Welcome back. Today we are going to talk about importing and baking an object. This should be the first couple things that you do before you actually start engaging with the object. So the first thing I'd like to do is come up to File, hit New, and that'll bring in the New Project tab. Up here at Template, you can drop down and choose what you want to work with if you're using metallic roughness, or if you're using PBR specular roughness, or if you're making something for a video game engine. For this purposes, we're just going to keep it as PBR metallic roughness. Next is your file. You're going to select your file, and for now I'm going to choose Grenade Mid. We have multiple different types of baking that we're going to show. The first one is going to be using a mid poly model, which has all the smoothing already inside of it. Basically, it's a higher polygon model. And then I'll bake that. And then I will also show you the high to low poly workflow. So first, just choose your object, hit open. It'll load it there. You get to choose your project size. We're going to go ahead and stay at 1024. As you go down, you can change these different things. I want to draw a little bit of attention to auto unwrap. If you did not do the UVs, you can do a drop down and hit recompute all, and it will auto do your UVs. For the current purpose, we're going to select generate only missing data. This means if there is UV data, it's going to leave it alone. If there is not UV data, it's going to correct it. So that's the standard, and we are not going to use UDIM. Alright, so I'm going to hit OK, and that should bring up our object. So this is a mid-poly object, so it's already smoothed, and I don't need to bake a high-poly version of it. But to work in Substance Painter, we have to bake in general so we can get editable properties for procedural texturing. So the first thing you want to do is make sure you go to your texture set settings. You're going to select this. Up top, you can select the map size that you want to view. We're going to stay at 1024. These channels that you see right here are the channels that can be edited in the layer stack, or what can be edited like you would in Photoshop. So in the layers, if you scroll all the way down, you can see that I can edit color, height, roughness, metal, and the normal. So if I go back up here, you can see these are the same channels that exist down here. So this allows us to edit all of those. If you want to add more, you hit that plus button, and you can add ambient occlusion. You can add emissive if you want something to glow, opacity if you want transparency in the object, or specular. And that will add another little square down here that you have the ability to edit. But to use these different channels with a procedural effect like a material or a smart material or a generator, which we'll get into in later videos, you need these maps. And to get these maps, you have to hit Bake Mesh Maps. This will bring up our baking. These are the maps you can choose and you can select. We have normal, world space normal, ID. ID is a way of it color codes materials, so then you can mask out by those materials instead of by hand. So if I were to bring up my get rid of my grenade low and go high, I have assigned each component a different material, a different color material. So when I bring it in the Substance Painter and only want to affect the base, I can make a mask off of that material. There will be a bonus lecture on that. I don't need it for now. Ambient Occlusion, which is self-shadowing, basically projecting shadows on it. A curvature map, position map, and thickness map, which are basically just mathematical equations that will develop maps based on the curvature or the thickness of an object, and that way Substance Painter can read it. So once we have these checked, we can come over here. I leave dilation width alone. Apply diffusion, I leave alone. High poly parameters, this is what's going to be important. Since this is a mid-poly object and it's already smooth, I do not need to engage this with a high poly down here. So I can put use low poly mesh as high poly mesh, since I'm not going to have a low and a high. I'm just using a high. I can come down here. If you're familiar with a cage, you can select it and upload it. If not, that's what these distances are. It raycasts out from each vertex in a forward and rear according to this distance, and will bake accordingly to whatever's inside of that distance. I leave everything selected. Anti-aliasing, you can play around with the different styles and see if it looks better. You can always rebake if the bake comes out wrong. Next, I'm going to go ahead and match by mesh name, and these things down here I'll cover more in the next section, which will be low to high poly baking. But for now, I'm just going to title it high and high because this object is high and high. So now I'm going to bake, and this should go pretty quickly. Okay, so there we go. As you can see, it populated all of these maps in here, and now we would be good to go to start texturing this object. Okay, the next thing that I want to show you, go back to new. I'm going to create a new file. I'm going to select the low poly. Open. Leave it at 1024. Everything's going to stay the same. Okay, I'm going to discard this project. Now it's a low poly. You can see that it's angular. This is an extremely low poly model, so you can see that things are squared. So this is meant to be seen at a distance. But I still need those maps, and I want to be able to use, I want this to appear smooth at a distance and use the maps of a higher model. So just like before, in texture settings, I'm going to go to bake map. In here, I'm going to leave it at, let's jump to 1024, ID map. Instead of clicking here, use low poly mesh as high poly mesh, I'm actually going to come down to high definition meshes. I'm going to click this, and I'm going to select grenade underscore high. Good. Now, the one that you see is grenade underscore low. This is grenade underscore high. I'm going to leave the distances the same. I can even crank this up if I want. We can do anti-aliasing match. And for here, for match, what we want to do is make sure we choose by mesh name. And this is where this becomes important. So if we select always, it will bake this object as is. It won't segregate the different pieces. It will just bake. And these distances, if too far, you could get something like it's called bleeding or projection, and you could get normal or ambient occlusion issues from this ring projected onto the head of the grenade, and it would look wrong. And I can show you an example of that afterwards. So for my purposes, instead of exploding this model for baking, I'm just going to choose by mesh name. The low poly mesh will be underscore low, and the high poly mesh will be underscore high. And to show you what that means, I'm going to bring you over here. So if here we go. So I have my low poly mesh, and my low and my high. And if you look inside these folders, I have the exact same objects labeled the exact same way, all case sensitive, except for it's underscore high for the high and underscore low for the low. And it goes for each thing, the pivot pin, hand grip. So this is going to allow us to bake. So in Substance Painter, when I select by mesh name, it's going to look for the naming convention, and then it's going to look for underscore high and underscore low. Then it's only going to bake this with this, and we're not going to get any bleeding or projection. So that's why it's important, and that's why the naming convention is important. So let's go ahead and hit bake. Good. You can see that everything came through. We're getting a little bit of ambient occlusion issues because of how low poly this is, but at a distance it'll be fine. I can also show you what this would look like if I just hit always and we didn't go through that process of segregating the meshes. See, now we're getting a little bit of bleeding. This, you can see, is mirroring itself or projecting itself over here. And that's because of the distance that I had on the bake. And you can see it under here too, because it's baking it as an entire model instead of independent component pieces. So let's go back to bake. Let's go back to by mesh name, and let's bake it again. And you can see that issue's taken care of. It's no longer a problem. Okay, so that is how you import and how you bake. From here, And in the next video, we will go into how to set up a texture stack and using layers. There's one other quick thing that I wanted to cover. I'm gonna go to no. So if I choose that grenade, if I choose the grenade low, again, hit open, leave everything the same. And let's say that I wanted to bake with a high version. So if I hit bake mesh maps, for here I'm going to select, and I'm going to choose grenade high with an ambient issue, okay? And I'm going to choose by mesh name. I don't need an ID map. And I'm going to go ahead and bake. And I want to show a little bit. So it's a low mesh, and we'll see some issues here, and I want to show you what that's from. Because sometimes you will see issues. Hide. Sometimes you will see issues in baking if everything doesn't line up properly. So let me go ahead and bring this in. Import. Hi. Oh, is it not going to import? Okay, let's go ahead and delete this. Let's go ahead and import this. Import. There we go. So the difference between the previous version and this version is you can see that the width here and how angular it is compared to this. I let this smooth out, so this head, especially in this area, doesn't match this area. So that's going to cause this to be projected onto that. If you look at previously what I did, if I were to delete this and bring in the high poly, you would see that it actually matches. But for this instance, I used the bad version, and that's what created this little bit of black right there, because that it creates normal issues and ambient occlusion issues. You have the ability in Substance to come in here and disable these maps. That means you won't be able to utilize these maps, the ones that you disable, in the texturing process procedurally. But that might be okay sometimes. Like right here, I know that it's a Substance Painter ambient occlusion issue. So if I uncheck this, we can see we have a little bit of normal issues, but the ambient occlusion is gone, and now we can texture. And in a later video, I will show you how to edit these maps inside Substance Painter. But if you see something like that, you might be able to get by without having an occlusion map. But normally you want things to match up perfectly. So thanks for stopping by. Today we covered importing models, and we covered baking, the first two steps when you're starting a project. Next we will cover how to actually start painting on this and what the different kinds of layers are. Thank you.